Anarkata politics. Anarkatas believe that all hierarchies subject black people to forms of capture, captivity, and commodification. Due to the historical processes of African enslavement that marked and transformed African bodies into property, chattel, and non-human merchandise, black people have a particular vulnerability to captivity that is anchored by our bodies being marked as inhuman. Because of this, Anarkatas believe that all forces of oppression experienced by black people, including white supremacy, ableism, cis-heterosexism, capitalism, colonialism, humanism, misogynoir, trans-misogynoir, and patriarchy, consists of hierarchical layers of power that place black people in continued positions of vulnerability to capture, enslavement, and death under colonialism and capitalism. They form borders that cage our black bodies in overlapping prisons of objectification. Because of this, Anarkatas seek to destroy and abolish all forms of hierarchical oppression. Anarkatas understand hierarchy as always subjecting black people to these dangers. Anarkatas say states are formalized hierarchical structures that primarily benefit the ruling class and centralize power to protect the ruling class's material interests. The modern state was invented to secure the material interests of Western Empire through the notion of modern sovereignty in the Treaty of Westphalia. States uphold the economy of black suffering, commodification, and African dispossession, engendered through slavery and colonialism, and in so doing enable the capture, enslavement, and securance of black people and lands as property. The Westphalian nation-state crystallizes these anti-black and colonial and capitalist functions of statism by ideologically centering the human, citizen subject as its main concern, while excluding black people and rendering us as enslavable under the state. States consolidate the power that allow for our thingification to be possible, and depend on the police to protect and enforce its hierarchies, codifying anti-blackness in law. Anarkatas maintain that all states are inherently anti-black structures of governance, ultimately incapable in bringing black people toward full self-determination and autonomous community formations. Whatever provision of protection from violence that a state, especially a Westphalian one, may provide is limited in the face of capital and white supremacy. Anarkatas therefore link neither national liberation, autonomous community formation, nor self-determination for black people to the formation of a state, and believe that all of these can and ultimately should be developed by the community in non-state formations. Anarkatas are against the existence of all states everywhere due to their inherent anti-blackness and dependency on centralized power, forms of enclosure, and property securance. We see the formation of black nation-states as a dysfunctional, counter-revolutionary means to achieve black liberation because they pose serious weaknesses and do not release black African people from these initial vulnerabilities. However, we recognize the unifying role of black nationalism in anti-colonial movements and affirm that the continuing debate around our way forward must be worked out among ourselves without any interference from non-black people. Anarkatas say that capitalism is a fundamentally genocidal and ecocidal system of accumulation that is European in origin. Capitalism corrupts and co-opts people's relationships to one another and the environment through making our bodies and labor subject to the hands of the white, able-bodied, Christian, cis-heterosexual few. The profit-driven motives of capitalism put it on a collision course with the people and the planet. Anarkatas understand profit gain to be a mutation of our relationships to one another, and the environment because it monetizes our basic needs. Under capitalism, open access to the very means of survival and the connections to the environment that this access entails is foreclosed to us. Instead, it is mediated by a racialized colonial class rule. It is a hierarchical arrangement that renders our activity in the environment and relationships to one another as now redefined by and subject to the logic of a ruling class and their quote-unquote rights to quote-unquote property. Their property is secured by a state or government apparatus and its armed forces. Under the hands of the state, a small subset of people exercise material ownership over the natural resources of the planet and determine who has access to the material means of survival. The rest of us are placed in a position where we are forced to sell our labor for a wage because there is no other option allowed by the ruling class and their government protections, i.e., there is no other way to get direct access to our material needs without coming under the fire of the state or the armed forces, who are here to hold down resources for the most powerful. The purpose of this rigged setup and the theft coercion of our labor is to make every relationship in our society about producing and selling commodities on a market. This market allows for constant accumulation of resources, and it flattens the value of goods through an easily quantifiable medium of exchange, currency or money. This process seeks to commodify everything from land to water, to food and even air. Capitalist thought tends to portray this market-based and growth and gain-seeking as good for the collective and as the best economic system our species has to offer. But its basis and starting place is in an alienation of the masses from the material means of survival, the earthly source of our power. And in the end, it only truly benefits the few. Through slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and later globalization, the forces of capital extended their reach upon the planet and partitioned it into sectors of industrialization, development, and undevelopment. This creates an inherently exploitative relationship between the industrialized global north and the underdeveloped global south, which is the highest expression of a systematic alienation of the people from access to and open use of the material means of survival. Anarkatas maintain that the linchpin of the capitalist system is this continued wholesale theft, exploitation, and intentional underdevelopment of the Third World by the West. The peoples of the Third World are consumed and torn apart by the ebb and flow of world markets, which force the production of goods by non-white laborers for extremely low costs to the capitalists. Third world countries are pressured further to be export countries and trash dump countries, completely dependent on exports to remain solvent, and vulnerable to the careless disposal of toxic waste from first world corporations and militaries that are deposited onto indigenous lands during the production process. Administrative puppets, state corruption, and corporate collaboration caused by hierarchical authoritarian aspirations to power work to keep the people destitute and dependent on this arrangement. Third world labor is elicited by Western corporations at extremely low prices, which drive their overseas activities in oil, mining, agricultural, manufacturing, and other industries that benefit Western capitalist interests. Oftentimes, third world laborers can't even afford the goods they help to produce, and the wages that they do earn are often redirected back to the Western capitalists via globalized consumerism. If under capitalism, the masses are forced to sell our labor to the forces of production in order to survive, then Black people in particular, especially the most marginal of us, are incorporated into the capitalist economy not as laborers or workers in the proper sense, but as commodities ourselves, held captive by the web of commerce. Historically, the commodification of black people's bodies under enslavement provided a source of free labor that enabled the process of state imperial property accumulation, giving rise to capitalism in the first place. By way of slavery, capitalism rendered us as bodies that do not own our labor and do not have a value assigned to our labor, which prevents us from entering into the usual workers' relationship of exchange, where we can barter our labor for our basic needs. Black labor under the capitalist system is always inherently of no value, precisely because of this historical relationship of enslavement. Black labor under capitalism is instead folded into the means of production itself as another resource, free for anyone to exploit or plunder at little to no cost to them. In having our labor folded into the position of non-human things, black labor is taken captive as property of the capitalists and colonizers for their material gain. The state protects and grounds this arrangement of normative property relations and allows for the accumulation and co-option of black toil, especially labor exerted by the most marginal. This means black labor in the third and fourth worlds. This means prison labor, domestic labor, sex work, emotional labor, and other forms of black labor that are elicited largely from femmes, prisoners, QTG&C people, and others in the black community. When Anarkatas speak of the inhuman black labor which white supremacist capitalism systematically devalues and makes readily available to non-black consumers, we are centering trans women's struggles, sex workers, domestic laborers, and prisoner struggles. These represent the archetypal black laborer, who often gets relegated to the position of the unthought, and whose super-exploitation undergirds our collective position as a commodity within the capitalist system. They are on the front lines of the heightened state violence all black people face. This makes black labor struggle beyond proletarian. It does not properly occupy the position of the proletariat as conceived by Marx. Under a capitalist system, we are not only vulnerable to exploitation, but also to ourselves being commodified and accumulated by the anti-black force of capitalist colonial production. The commodification of our bodies and their incorporation into the means of production both engender and stem from a structure of anti-blackness that undergirds the logics of white supremacist capitalism. When Anarkatas speak of anti-blackness, we are referring to a process resting on a human-non-human antagonism. By this we mean that anti-blackness is an expression of the violent, exploitative relationship between humans and the rest of the non-human world, since the dehumanizing racialization of black people that has marked us as inhuman is tied to the ongoing colonial capitalist violation of Africa. The modern global system and its mass ecocide rely on what Aimé Césaire called thingification. During slavery and colonialism, this process of thingification reduced African people's bodies to non-human objects. Anti-blackness figures into the thingification process by symbolically marking us as inhuman and further enabling our conversion into property. Our skin is made to carry this marker that signifies the non-human, the monstrous, and the extinguishable. To quote Christina Sharp, "Black people ejected from the state become the national symbols for the less than human being condemned to death." Anarkatas connect black struggle to environmental struggle because of black people's bodies being symbolically alienated from the human, i.e., structures of civilization such as state citizenship, that the idea of human signifies, and treated as another natural resource to be extracted and exploited for human, read white, consumption. The violent destruction of our bodies and exploitation of the land of our ancestors is how modern Western capitalist ecocide, or the Anthropocene, was born. Black/African homelands had long since been encroached upon for the purpose of enslavement, but with the advent of European colonialism and the taking captive of land by Western imperial states, the capitalist arrangement transformed slave labor into both a commodity and a tool to produce more commodities for the market, built on constant growth and environmental devastation. Both black people and our homelands became reduced to a technology of profit, a mere mechanism upon which European class rule was propped up. As Linda Brent said in Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, anti-blackness meant enslaved Africans are, quote, no more, in the sight of their masters, than the cotton they plant or the horses they tend. To this day, robbery of African resources remains crucial to how global capitalism operates. Negated from humanity then, and exploited as and along with the dirt or cattle or crops, all of which have needs which go unrecognized, black struggle becomes the epitome, as Annie Olaloku Teriba says, of alienation and exploitation. The destruction of Africa and African people is vital to the Euro-colonial system of vampirism, whose technologies need materials, labor, and other resources stolen from Africa. The human emerges as a construct that becomes the face of anti-blackness, white supremacy, and environmental destruction. Anarkata recognized the centrality of an anti-black and ecocidal human construct, developed in the modern world as inextricably tied to colonial, hierarchical, cis-heteropatriarchal, and disabling constructs. Channeling Sylvia Wynter, we learn that the human is an invention of European Renaissance and Enlightenment thought that aim to qualify and articulate the validity of Euro-colonial capitalism's developing class dominations, and justify the imperial/colonial theft of indigenous land and bodies. The human construct was built primarily on earlier Euro-Christian biases against sexuality and the material world as satanic, which the church used to ideologically dehumanize European laypeople. These were then reapplied to African people's bodies and lands, so that such laypersons could justify humanizing themselves through mastery over the satanic, or African and black people's bodies and lands. In this instance, blackness becomes an opposing pole from which the community of man, as a subject and a citizen of the state with rights, manifested. The secularization of Western thought and the rise of Western science introduced new ways of thinking about the human, indexing humanness through biology and genetics. The scientific quest for humanness objectified both living and dead African people's body parts through brutal experimentation to classify the human from the inhuman. The definitions which ensued then rendered unnatural or subhuman the realities of black gender variance, disability, fatness, alongside the more commonly known phenotypic features, such as hair textures, skin colors, and nose shapes associated with African people. The human construct in the modern world continues to get deployed against black people and all other forms of life, with horrible consequences for the lives of the most vulnerable black people, especially trans and disabled black folks. Anarkatas reject humanism and see our liberation as tied to the liberation of all non-human entities, actual things, that are adversely affected by this alienating construct and the structures of capitalism, colonialism, and Eurocentrism which ground it. Instead of trying to prove our humanity and be seen as humans by the white power structure, and instead of trying to ground our liberation in humanization as a conceptual framework and aspiration, we should work towards. Anarkatas seek to abolish the human construct as the center of empowerment completely, and look towards new ways of understanding being and personhood, and ultimately, new ways by which we actively tend toward our collective transformation. In the words of Calvin Warren, as long as we continue to invest in the value structure that renders the human the highest, most important being in the world, we will continue to plead for recognition and acceptance. Anarkatas seek to forge new modes of being where one does not need to prove their humanness or evoke human rights to be treated with value and dignity. Our personhood cannot be captured or indexed by humanness, and our struggle is to step out into new waters of selfhood and relation that leave this construct behind. Calvin Warren continues, either we will continue this degrading quest for human rights and incorporation, or we will take a leap of faith and reject the terms through which we organize our existence. Anarkatas maintain that black people are assigned gender differently from the human, due to the historical process of enslavement and thingification that marked us as inhuman. Taking cues from Hortense Spillers, Anarkatas understand that when gender is assigned to black people, it is not in the human sense and is akin to when a thing, object, or piece of property is assigned a gender. The colonizing process wipes clean any other ontology or way of being, including our gender/sexual diversity, particularity, and autonomy that African people historically had before Western invasion. They did this in order to racialize, and thus dehumanize, us. In this process of redefinition and racialization, black people's bodies are ungendered, rendered as an abnormal canvas for the white patriarch to deposit a gender assignment onto us. Therefore, black people experience the process of gender assignment as an anti-black process grounded in histories of capture and extreme forms of anti-black violence. For this reason, Anarkata understands gender as always being racialized, and racialization as always gendered. Anarkatas believe, however, that gender as a social construct can be a powerful means of self-making and reclamation of bodily autonomy. In this way, gender can be repurposed to defy the rigid confines of the traditional colonial gender binary. In the hands of patriarchal capitalist society, however, gender is used to produce sexual hierarchies based on a reductive vision of sexual anatomy and genetics that violently assigns worth and divides labor among individuals. The state assigns gender to people's bodies without their consent and polices the borders of the gender binary and gender expression through violence, law, infrastructure, and propaganda. Under this oppression, African/black people, especially trans women and all other non-men, are systematically exploited and subjected to endless abuses by those who are called men. Anarkatas emphasize that trans and gender nonconforming black people are those most affected by this colonial imposition of gender. In fact, black queer people are the primary target of its inception, especially black trans women, who are scapegoated as the quintessence or highest example of presumed inhuman Negro depravity, as was said of Francis Thompson after the brutal misogynoiristic Memphis Massacre of 1866, which is taken from the Euro-Christian sexual biases inherited by the human construct. While pre-colonial Africa was by no means a monolith in terms of gender/sexual diversity, many of our ancestors had ways of being that would today be rendered trans, gender nonconforming, queer. Oftentimes, spiritual leaders in African traditions were what would today be considered queer, trans, gender nonconforming. Europeans encountered this and so used religion to demonize transness, gender nonconformity, and queerness in order to destroy cultural practices that helped African people form community. This way, colonizers could successfully impose a hierarchical redefinition of our people that dislocate us from vital cultural and spiritual sites of strength, aiding in their imperial capture of land and body. The gender construct emerges as a binary under colonialism to clear away populations and help advance Western capitalist interests in violating our lands and bodies and reducing us all to mechanisms of profit. It is important for Anarkatas to emphasize Moya Bailey's concept of misogynoir when understanding that modern gender is a colonial/racialized imposition. If we look to Carl Linnaeus's contributions to Western scientific taxonomy as an example, we can analyze the Linnaean categorization of the biosphere into different kingdoms, plant and animal, phyla, classes, etc. And we will find that Linnaeus also developed racist taxonomies for our species in particular. In that process, he developed a dehumanizing classification of Black/African people that relied on a gendered objectification of those he marked as African women. Furthermore, the hypersexualization of our bodies as Black people within the gender-based tropes, i.e., the mammy, Jezebel, the angry or strong Black woman or man, is an expression of the fact that misogynoir structures and is central to the colonial ungendering process. That Black gender cannot be disassociated from a constriction of us as criminally, abnormally, or predatorily hypersexual, whereas white gender is considered normal, originates from slavery and demonstrates the violence of the gender binary and its role in upholding carceral and colonial control over us. Anarkatas maintain that Black womanhood is at the center of this hypersexualized imposition of gender, by which African people have been racialized and dehumanized. Aside from Linnaeus's racist taxonomies, we can also look to the violence against Sarah Bartman and the objectification and animalizing of her people, Khoi women, by which so many misogynoiristic tropes about Black women's bodies and sexualities have been created. It is these which have continued to be used to justify racist and capitalist violence against Black people writ large. Anarkatas also take cues from Trudy of Gradient Layers' addition to Moya Bailey's term by foregrounding trans-misogynoir in how we understand what violence structures and is at the heart of the colonial ungendering process. Therefore, if Anarkatas say that gender is central to Black dehumanization and racialization, and that the objectification of African womanhood is at the center of that colonial ungendering process, we also mean that transness and trans womanhood is the key to how we can trace, and, as C. Raleigh Snorton called it, transect, this Black women's gender struggle most accurately and effectively. Saidiya Hartman says that Black women's labor makes apparent the gender nonconformity of Black community and struggle, and Spillers encourages Black resistance to embrace the subversive power that the engendering of Black women signifies. Yet we can and should start from Black transness and Black gender variance when analyzing Black gendered violence, lest we fail to confront colonial cis-heterosexism in our analysis and center cis people. Centering Black trans women here is vital to our analysis because trans and gender nonconforming Black folk are the most isolated by the gender binary. Again, The binary was imposed to enforce divide and rule through hierarchy, to dehumanize and justify domination, and to dislocate us from communities of resistance and QTGNC leadership. Through it, white supremacy makes a criminalizing and demonizing specter of black trans women, who become the target of Euro-Christian sexual biases that the human construct was originally measured against. Colonialism uses this specter as a fulcrum against black liberation writ large. The above stated is central to how Anarkatas understand masculinism among black men. Anarkatas say that in this milieu, where gender is imposed by the colonizer to racialize and dehumanize us and thus divide us by isolating and demonizing and objectifying trans women, all to secure imperial interests, black people who are assigned to the status of men get positioned to derive degrees of psychological and even material benefit from being in proximity to white supremacy's inherently patriarchal, sexist, and transphobic structure. This is true even if they will never be considered properly man by the white patriarch, and are thus unable to hold the status of man in the human sense of the word. That position of black men, as being man yet not, is expressly built into the gender system to keep black people oppressed as a whole through divide and rule. Black men who align with this assignment of manhood are intentionally conditioned to aspire toward the idealized apex of that gender construct, which is tied to capitalism's definitions of man, such as the breadwinner and husband, for example. And since white humanism and capitalist oppression negate full participation in those roles, masculine aspirations to be white, human, are by design the single biggest internal problem and contradiction faced by our communities. Because black men then insist on reclaiming something that is constantly refused to them. This produces queer-mesia and trans-misogynoir, where trans women in particular are marked as treacherous, as Trudy from Gradient Layer points out, to black cis men's supposed right to power and control under capitalism and the state, and threatening to their masculinist values. Cis men become invested in a hierarchy that causes them to continue to sabotage black revolutionary struggle, defending the fictions of masculinity and maleness while conflating humanness with authority. In doing so, they expose all black people to forms of violence, abuse, and danger by buying into colonial trans-misogynoir and its uses, instead of acting against it in solidarity with black trans women. Institutionalized gender, therefore, limits the bodily autonomy of all people because it is colonial in origin and invented as a means of abetting the dehumanizing process of African racialization and justifying the taking captive our land and bodies. Yet, trans liberation and gender autonomy upend the logics of racialized biological difference that modern gender signifies, and pose a challenge to forced sexual roles that capitalism requires for its exploitation of our land and bodies. Decolonization means struggling for all of us as black people to have the autonomy to choose and define our own gender expressions for ourselves, change gender expressions at will, create new genders, or opt out of gender completely. Gender sexual liberation within the decolonization project also means the freedom to establish alternative models of kinship and relating, and a recognition that our capacity for altering our conditions and for building strong communities is not determined by values created around our biology or sexual ontology. The basis of humanism in this sense is rejected by queer anarkatas. Queer, trans, and gender non-conforming black people are thus reclaiming our black bodies beyond the snares of slavery. and the movements we lead is proof that black people should quickly abandon trying to reclaim the authority of white power's fallacious appeals to human biological nature that modern gender sexual constructs uphold. Such authority was only invented for the express purpose of domination, Eurocultural hegemony, and class rule. Ableism is another hierarchy that is perpetuated by the state and used on a structural level to mark the capitalist value of our bodies along bases of physical and psychological capability. The production needs of capitalism orient themselves around an idealized, abled body and structurally accommodates this body as the worker and the citizen, using appeals to this body through propaganda in order to push forward capitalism. The Western myth of meritocracy is an ableist piece of propaganda that suggests hard work will be rewarded by capitalism, while completely disregarding disabled individuals and rendering them as disposable. Anarkata believes that because black people are rendered as inhuman under white supremacy, and because our incorporation into capitalism was through slavery, the value of our bodies are entirely based on our labor output and use value. Black people's bodies have been valued completely on the basis of labor output, and under slavery has been stretched to its absolute limits, maimed and brutalized, until our bodies was no longer able and were disposed of. The oppressive conditions of black existence not only demanded, and continue to demand, that black people's bodies be able-bodied for the purposes of white capitalist interests, but also strained disabled black bodies to the brink of destruction. The traumas of white terror were and are often the very factors that produce disabilities in some black people and exacerbate pre-existing conditions in others. Disabled black people experience ableism on a continuum of anti-black violence, where state mistreatment and paternalism toward us is a direct consequence of slavery and infinitely tied to carceral formations across the colonial world. In this milieu, disabled black people are constantly read as a monstrosity, in need of being forcibly warehoused, deemed a negligible drain on resources that should be neutralized. Black disabled people are marked as damaged property while also being subjected to the extraneous circumstances that come with living under white supremacist capitalism. Racial dehumanization means black disabilities are erased in the popular imagination because we are regarded as one with other things that deserve to be structurally broken down and exploited. The oppression of all black people, the negation of black humanity, and how it engenders queerphobia, anti-fatness, human centrism, is all figured through disableism. When colonizers built a scientific framework over the Euro-Christian biases they used to dehumanize us, the brutal experiments practiced on our body parts, whether we were dead or alive, in order to define the human as a being able to have rulership within capitalism or the state, relied on disableist understandings of African difference. The notion of an abled body and abled mind was constructed by colonial European understandings of what constitutes a proper human body, and what kind of body is deserving of rights and subjecthood. And that propriety is based in justifying colonialist accumulation of resources and people as property, and thus defining who has right under the state to participate in class rule and capitalism. Disableism is tied to humanism because some lived corporeal needs and realities are pushed aside, demonized as unnatural or unholy and outside of the fold of man as a state subject. Colonizers objectified African people's bodies and marked us as criminally hypersexual in this disableist schema. Colonizers deemed runaway slaves in pursuit of freedom as crazy in this disableist schema. Today, African ways of life are marked as deviant from cognitive normativity, dismissed as merely delusional. Black QTG and C people are often deemed delusional for taking autonomy over our own identities, ontology, and biology back from oppressive society. Black girls get marked fast, as if they are all inherently sexual and abnormal in their asexuality. Popular visions of intelligence and sentience always exclude Black people, marking us as unable to think or feel. This has adverse consequences for those of us who have medical needs and disabilities, because these then get ignored, especially for trans women. Most grotesquely, we find in the prisons an overwhelming number of disabled people whose needs are overlooked or even made worse by the toxic and abusive carceral environment. All the while, Black people are thought of as deserving the prison and its violences for supposedly having an insane nature that makes us criminal. Disableism is central to upholding colonial arrogance over the inhuman labor resource that white supremacy and anti-Blackness reduces our people's bodies to. Anarkata maintains that disability justice is about the bodily autonomy of our people outside of slavery and imperialism. Disability justice says that our destitute conditions are not because something is innately wrong with us and our bodies or minds, but because violent hierarchical structures force us out of our capacity to meet our needs. Anarkatas affirm that we will never be free until all Black people, especially disabled people, are free to practice bodily autonomy and meet our needs with the full support of the Black community. Anarkatas push disability justice because we know our support will and can come from us, not the state. This support will recognize our whole persons and selves however we are shaped, or may change and work to affirm us, by us, for us. This support will push us beyond subjection to the state and capitalism's reduction of us to an inhuman labor resource by calling us to reclaim our full selves and struggle for our needs by our own hands. This support is eco-political because in striving to meet our needs, we will then need restoration within our environment in order to get the material means of survival in that environment. And we will need to understand our biology and neurology within the complexity that is the ecological world, beyond reductions imposed by our class/colonial enemies. Anarkatas say that disability justice is ultimately about people power in its clearest sense, and see it as central to all of the political positions we espouse here. Our insistence on freedom for all Black people extends to all members of the African diaspora and is explicitly Pan-African in its vision. We recognize that we are all connected due to the histories of colonialism, the slave trade and wide-scale migration, voluntary or otherwise, which have dispersed people of African descent all across the globe. The children of Africa have encountered anti-Black violence wherever we have gone, due to these collective histories that have influenced the ways in which Black people's bodies are read, and how the Black symbolic appears in hegemonic systems all over the world. We maintain that anti-Blackness both precedes and exceeds the emergence of the West through forms such as the presence of African slavery in the Arab world, the colonization of Northern Africa by the Roman Empire, and ultimately the Abrahamic religious ideology of Hamitism. But we recognize that it has been redefined and consolidated through the Western emergence of white supremacy and racial science. The catastrophic events of Atlantic chattel slavery rendered the Black African a symbol of non-human property under colonialism. This provided the material and ideological foundations for the capitalist exploitation, imperialism, and colonization of the African continent by the European powers. The pillaging of the continent of Africa, using the motherland as the belly of the modern world, and a continental plantation, have been done for the material benefit of those in power. For this reason, we feel a kinship with and seek to destroy empire's hold on the continent of Africa and the people of the African diaspora worldwide. Unless all black people everywhere are liberated, and unless the African continent is released from its bondage, none of us are free. Finally, we take Anarkata politics to be relevant to Pan-African liberation, the liberation of black peoples worldwide, in an age of massive climate instability. If black struggle and liberation of the planet are intertwined, then environmental issues force us to center Black/African people suffering under Western imperialism and neocolonialism. We put Africa at the center of the extractive processes of capital that uphold global ecocide. Africa must be emancipated, and those who are unjustly domesticated in the belly of the beast, in the imperial core that is the first world capitalist parasite, which feeds off of Africa in the third world, have a duty to fight against the militarism and imperialism that have pushed the planet to disaster. All of us must free ourselves of the Anthropocene, of the colonial, humans, violent, capitalist transformation of the planet. We recognize the unmatched ecological devastation of the planet as a result of colonial systems that have a unique and disproportionate impact on black people of the global South. We see the major role the American military and American corporations have played in the constant production and exploitation of this global black vulnerability to environmental death and destruction. We also see that climate catastrophe is posing a challenge to Westphalian statehoods and borders as a whole, intensifying migrations and threatening resources the world over, and bringing with it increased risks of authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism. We thus envision a green movement that is firmly anti-imperial and pan-African in its outlook and is grounded in Anarkata politics. Starting from increased attention to environmental racism and the uneven impact of ecological hazards on black people, our praxis centers radical solutions which connect localized black struggles to that of black people across all nations and borders, and which look to solutions that unite us in reclamation and restoration of the planet, connecting all the people to the earthly source of our power.